We celebrate the 40th anniversary of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton Church, a combination of two dynamic parishes, St. Mary's Church and Sacred Heart Church, in 1975. The early history of these two churches would not be complete without tracing the long and rich history of the first Catholic church in Chautauqua County, from which all of the Catholic parishes in the county were established. Starting meagerly with a wood-framed mission on the corner of 2nd and Robin Street, the parish has gone full circle to the present 161-year-old brick church on Washington Avenue. The village of Dunkirk, New York, was incorporated in the early 1800s. There were no Catholic inhabitants until about 10 years later, when the Right Reverend John Timon, who had been consecrated as the first Bishop of Buffalo in October of 1847, came to Dunkirk in the following year. He found a handful of Catholics so poor as to be unable to provide him with a suitable place in which to celebrate Holy Mass, and he had to go to Fredonia for that purpose. However, a beginning had been made, and the zealous bishop gave himself no rest until he should be able to make permanent provision for his little flock in Dunkirk. During the next few years, the Reverend Thomas McAvoy and other priests attended the Catholic population here, holding divine service in the home of William O'Neill on Front Street. In 1850, a plot of ground on West Front Street was given to the bishop by the Devereux family, but for some reason, this location was not found convenient for the proposed chapel. Early in the following year, another strip of land was acquired by the bishop. This was on 2nd Street between Robin and Plover Streets. Two frame structures already stood on the premises. One of these was adapted for the chapel, and the other served as the residence of the newly appointed pastor, the Reverend W. Lennon. This represented the definite establishment of what was to be St. Mary's Parish. An old resident later described this first Catholic church in Dunkirk as a long frame building, a low squatty affair with a hip roof shingled, the side posts being about 12 or 14 feet high, lined up the outside with clapboards, the insides and ceiling being plastered. Yet this poor structure was dear to those who worshipped God within its walls, and who found there consolation and grace. When the bishop again visited Dunkirk that same year, he expressed his joy at the condition of affairs, and asked God's blessing on the mission. In the meantime, the coming of the Erie Railroad to Dunkirk brought a large increase in the Catholic population. The little chapel was no longer large enough, and the Reverend Peter Cogan, who had succeeded Father Lennon, after a few months found it necessary to plan for a more convenient location and larger church. On July 23, 1852, he purchased the present site on Washington Avenue. The ground was at once cleared, and work on the foundations of the new church was begun. The laying of the cornerstone in the following year made the occasion of an enthusiastic demonstration on the part of the parishioners, whose numbers at that time is indicated by a subscription list containing more than 440 names. The solemn ceremony was performed by the Vicar General of the diocese, the Very Reverend Peter Beatty. The masonry and plastering were done by P. Rogan. The contract for the brickwork was given to P. Rogan and Jacob Staller. Samuel Jones was the carpenter, joiner, and pew builder. The stained windows were furnished by G&W Morgan of Brooklyn. G. House of Buffalo built the organ. The painting and frescoing were done by Thomas Coleman of Troy. The architect was P.C. Keeley of Brooklyn, a master among American church architects. Work on the new church proceeded so rapidly that Father Colgan was able to celebrate Holy Mass in it for the first time on the Feast of St. Patrick in 1854, and to have the structure blessed on November 11th of the same year. This first dedication of St. Mary's was performed by the Right Reverend Joshua Young, Bishop of Erie. Bishop Young was assisted by a large number of clergy, and his eloquent sermon on the occasion made a deep impression on the many Protestants who attended, as well as on the parishioners. April 20th, 1860 is another outstanding date in the history of this parish, for on that day the Passionist Fathers came to assume charge. Bishop Timon had been anxious for several years to secure the cooperation of the Passionists for the work of his diocese, but their limited numbers had forced them to delay in complying with his request. Their establishment in Dunkirk represented the second foundation of the congregation in this country. While the people of the parish took reluctant leave of their devoted and able pastor, Father Colgan, who was deservedly promoted to the cathedral in Buffalo, they prepared a truly royal welcome for the religious who were coming among them, and with whom they were to maintain such happy relations of affection and hearty cooperation throughout the ensuing years. On April 19, 1861, Father Albinus Magno came to take permanent charge. Father Colgan met him at the railroad station with a carriage rented for the occasion. On the following Sunday, the new pastor of St. Mary's was introduced to the people. Father Colgan said goodbye, and the Passionist era in Dunkirk began. In November of 1861, Bishop Timon legally transferred ownership of the church, school, and cemetery to the monastic corporation. St. Mary's Parish was now St. Mary's Monastery and Parish. The land next to the church on Washington Avenue was now the property of the Passionists. On May 26, 1861, the Feast of the Most Holy Trinity, the cornerstone of St. Mary's Monastery was blessed by Bishop Timon. A little over a year later, the core of the building was completed. St. Mary's Monastery was blessed and officially opened on Sunday, July 20th, 1862. The education of young parishioners of the future was considered primary. At first, the Mission Church on 2nd Street was converted into a school, and the children attended there. Obviously, Old St. Mary's became too small, so Father Boniface Feld was put to work excavating a large earthen-floored schoolroom out of the church cellar. For several years, 3 Sisters of St. Joseph conducted classes in this area. Dedicated teachers do not demand an impressive physical plant for the planting of the seeds of knowledge. They only need dedicated learners. In cold and dampness, they would relocate to the church upstairs when the creek through the property burst its banks in spring flood time, leaving their benches floating in seepage. Under the direction of Father Albinus, one of his first acts was to improve the school. In 1864, a separate building, Columbus Hall, was built. St. Mary's School, even in those early days, maintained a standard which could hardly be excelled. Father Albinus had a keen appreciation of the importance of a good parochial school for the maintenance of vital Catholicism, and he devoted some of his best efforts to the welfare of the school. During Father Albinus's time, the church tower was completed and a spire built. In 1867, the tower clock was installed. This was to be known for long afterwards as the town clock. Thus, during these years, St. Mary's assumed the general exterior appearance which has been so long familiar to the people of Dunkirk. In 1873, however, the interior of the church was practically rebuilt. New flooring and a new roof were provided, with arched ceilings and many other improvements. This work, which resulted in a more secure and beautiful structure, was made possible through the great generosity of Hiram J. Minor, whose conversion to the church during the Civil War period made a profound impression on the townspeople. When the work of remodeling and redecorating had been completed, the church was rededicated, and this ceremony was performed on November 30th, 1873, by the Right Reverend Stephen Ryan, Bishop of Buffalo. The Golden Jubilee of the parish was observed on November 13th, 1904. The Jubilee year was commemorated by the issuance by Father Mark Mosleyan of a monthly bulletin, St. Mary's Record. These publications continued for 1 year. During the Jubilee year, Father Mark said, "It is but fitting that the church building, which has been so dear to the Catholic people of Dunkirk, which has been the scene of the happiest and most solemn moments in the lives of so many of them, and which has been sanctified throughout all these years by countless graces flowing within its walls, should receive at last the solemn rite of consecration by which it passes finally and irrevocably into the service of God." Father Mark had expressed the desire that the church might soon be consecrated, but the requirements of the liturgy in this matter are very exacting, and his wish had to be delayed until 1934. St. Mary's Monastery and Church was closed for 3 months and reopened in July of 1934 after renovations. The consecration of St. Mary's took place on May 16, 1935, by the Right Reverend Bishop Turner, Bishop of Buffalo. The Passionists were also busy establishing missions and building small churches in the county from St. Mary's Monastery. St. Mary's has the distinction of being the mother church of a large number of other parishes. In the early days, it included a very considerable territory within its borders, and its numerous missions became flourishing churches in their turn. Thus, the early records of this parish contain frequent references to the stations at Jamestown, Mayville, Sinclairville, Sherman, Cassadaga, French Creek, Brockton, Westfield, Stockton, Fredonia, Forestville, Sheridan, Silver Creek, Angola, Irving, North Evans, Gowanda, Cattaraugus, and Dayton. This explains why St. Mary's Church has long been regarded as a sanctuary and a place of pilgrimage by the people of the surrounding country. The Passionists served St. Mary's until August 1st, 1972. At that time, Buffalo diocesan priest assumed the staffing of the parish under Bishop McNulty. The parish served 1,300 families. Father Robert G. Oakes was the last priest to serve St. Mary's Church. Previous to the year 1857, the few German Catholic families in Dunkirk worshipped at St. Mary's Church. It was on August 16th of that year that the German people assembled at the residence of Jacob Staller on Lyon Street and decided to build a church for themselves. They were encouraged to do so by Reverend James Nagel of St. Mary's Church in Buffalo, New York, who came to Dunkirk to talk to the gathering. A lot was purchased on Ruggles Street near Lyon Street. The cost of the 60-foot by 100-foot plot was $300, and the construction of the church was begun at once. The wooden structure was to be 70 feet long and 35 feet wide, and the cost was estimated to be $1,695. It was finished the following year and dedicated in the honor of St. George on February 15, 1858, by the Reverend W. Dieter of St. Louis Church, Buffalo, New York. In March of 1863, the Passionist Fathers, who were in charge of St. Mary's since 1860, also took charge of this church. The Reverend Luke Lang was the first priest from that order to attend it from February 1863 until December of 1866. In 1864, a lot 30 by 100 adjoining the church was purchased for $200, thus making the property 90 by 100 feet, all of it on Ruggles Street. In 1865, a schoolhouse was built at the cost of $1,200. In 1873, the Sisters of St. Joseph's were installed as teachers. In the beginning, there were 90 to 100 children attending in the winter and 70 to 80 in the summer. Reverend Philip Burke was the next pastor from October 1866 until March of 1867. He introduced the payment of pew rent, but not without difficulty. 4 more pastors served the church from 1867, and during that time the church was incorporated. The parishioners became dissatisfied, things being rather disagreeable, and the Passionists withdrew entirely from the church in July of 1874. The Jesuit fathers came from Buffalo every Sunday until November of 1874, when Reverend Ferdinand Kolb was appointed the first resident pastor. George Dodderwyk deeded property to the congregation in 1875 to be used as a parochial residence for Father Kolb. Prior to that time, Father Kolb stayed with a private family. Then there arose the controversy about building another frame church or building a new one of brick. This question was settled when the few Polish families who were attending this church decided to build a brick church of their own. The Germans decided to do at least as well, and they too agreed to build of brick. The excavations were begun on April 23, 1876, and the cornerstone blessed on June 11th of the same year. The church was completed and dedicated to the Sacred Heart of Jesus on November 18, 1877, by Right Reverend Stephen Ryan, Bishop of Buffalo. The new church was Gothic in style, 117 feet long and 52 feet wide. The tower was 130 feet high. The architect was Mr. Beebe of Buffalo. The mason work was done by Jacob Staller. The carpentry work was done by John Kunzler. The pews and confessionals were built by Julius Mayer. The frescoing by G. Rosa of Pittsburgh. 3 bells of various sizes were donated by the Dodderwyk family at a cost of $1,750. The marble altar and communion railing, the organ and clock tower were donated by George Dodderwyk. As nearly all of the work was done by day labor, with everyone doing or donating something, it was hard to figure out the exact cost of the new church. However, the figure of $20,000 is not too high. The debt to the church was only $5,000, a good showing for a small congregation. After the new church was built, the old church, school, and rectory were sold and removed. Construction of a new school and rectory was started in 1884. They were built at a cost of about $18,000. To obtain room for the rectory, a lot was purchased on Railroad Avenue. thus giving the frontage of 120 feet on that street. When the buildings were completed in 1885, there was a debt of $12,000. In September of 1896, Reverend Joseph Teese came, and during his administration, the debt was liquidated in 1903. Another notable achievement was the installation of beautiful stained glass windows in the church. The golden anniversary was celebrated in 1908. Church records showed that there were 300 families in the congregation, over 200 children in the school, with 5 Sisters of St. Joseph in charge. Diamond Jubilee services were held on November 12, 1933. In the years prior to that, many improvements, such as a rebuilt steeple, new organ, steam heating, and the rewiring and installation of Gothic lantern fixtures. New pews and new confessionals were erected. On June 2, 1946, Father No was appointed pastor, and with his leadership, within 3 years, successful lawn festivals liquidated the debt again. Many improvements were undertaken to the church. Father No celebrated the 25th anniversary of his ordination on May 20th, 1956. A testimonial dinner attended by 500 of his friends and parishioners was held at Floral Hall. An auto was presented to him as a token of the esteem in which he was held by the parishioners. In 1957, preparations were made for the centennial, which was to be celebrated in 1958. Plans were made to have the church and rectory permastoned. Many other renovations to the buildings were planned. The school was closed in 1957, and St. Mary's School became the Central Grade School and renamed Our Lady of the Lake. It was attended by pupils from St. Mary's, Sacred Heart, and Holy Trinity. It did not work out well, and Sacred Heart School was reopened in September of 1958. The centennial celebration was December 7, 1958. There were 475 families in the parish. The centennial banquet was held at Floral Hall with Arthur Kaiser as Toastmaster. The next few years were uneventful, and Father No was transferred in September of 1960. Reverend Joseph Sharmach was appointed pastor in 1966 after the sudden death of Reverend Howard Adolph. The school was closed again in June of 1968 because of a shortage of nuns. In 1970 ushered in the entrance of the Dunkirk Urban Renewal Agency into the affairs of the parish. The agency offered to purchase the property for a sum of $337,000. A parish meeting was held to discuss the possibility of purchasing land on Brigham Road and building a new church there. It was decided to hold a referendum, and the proposal was defeated by the parishioners. A committee was formed to save the church. A meeting was held, and a proposal brought forth to canvass the parishioners to see how many were in favor of keeping or selling the church. A petition with over 700 names was soon presented to the church council, along with a statement from the many reasons they wanted to keep the church. Father Sharmak arranged for a meeting with His Excellency Bishop McNulty. He invited his trustees and a council member to go along with him and speak in favor of selling the church. He also invited 3 members of the Save Our Church Committee to present their objections to the sale. Things remained quiet for a time as the bishop made no move to have the property sold to Urban Renewal. In 1972, the Passionists left St. Mary's after serving them for 120 years. Rumors at the time were that Father Sharmak would be named pastor of both St. Mary's and Sacred Heart. However, Bishop McNulty changed his mind and invited priests of the diocese to apply for the pastorate at St. Mary's. Reverend Robert Oakes received the appointment. Rumors stopped and things became quiet again for quite some time. Bishop McNulty became ill and never recovered, and His Excellency Edward Hitt was named the bishop. Father Sharmak was transferred to St. Gerard Church in Buffalo in June of 1974. Reverend John Coleman, a hospital chaplain who resided at the rectory, took over temporarily until August, when Reverend Joseph Schultz arrived to take over the pastorate. He announced to the parishioners that he had a definite assurance from the chancery that the parish was to remain open. Everyone was relieved and plans were made for the future of the parish. On December 11, 1974, a local radio station announced in a newscast that the Sacred Heart property would be sold to the Urban Renewal Agency and the parish would be merged with St. Mary's. Denials were made and the Save Our Church Committee requested a public meeting with the Urban Renewal Agency and the bishop. On December 16th, they met with Urban Renewal at 5:30 p.m. and they were told that there were no funds available to purchase the property. Later that day, at 7 p.m., a meeting was held with the bishop, and he proposed selling the church property, merging with St. Mary's, and using the funds from the sale of the property to build a new complex at St. Mary's to serve both parishes. There was a lot of dissatisfaction and anger at this announcement. On January 30th, 1975, a closed session of the Urban Renewal Agency was held at City Hall. Dignitaries from the diocese were present along with 2 members of the Save Our Church Committee. Petitions were presented objecting to the closing and sale of the church property. The next agency meeting was held on March 10th. At this meeting, the Urban Renewal Agency voted 4-3 not to purchase the Sacred Heart property. The diocese withdrew their proposal to build the new complex because it hinged on the Urban Renewal Agency purchasing the Sacred Heart property for $337,000. A public announcement was made by Bishop Head on June 27, 1975, that there would be a new St. Elizabeth Ann Seton Parish in Dunkirk. Sacred Heart will be closed on September 15th, and the new merged parish will be at the former St. Mary's Church. The final Mass at Sacred Heart was at 12 p.m. on September 7, 1975.